Hey guys, tonight we will travel back to the winter night of 1457, when the stone walls of Bletsoe Castle rang out with a blood-curdling scream, the scream of 13-year-old Margaret Beaufort, writhing in labour beneath flickering candlelight. Picture the howling wind of a snowstorm lashing against the window, the blood-stained sheets beneath her, and the fragile heart of a child burdened with the fate of the woman destined to end a brutal conflict between two branches of English royalty that had vied for the throne for years. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment below to let me know where you are and what the local time is for you right now. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. On the bitterly cold winter night of 1457 at Bletsoe Castle, the scream of 13-year-old Lady Margaret Beaufort echoed through the frozen stone corridors. In a chamber lit only by flickering candles, the girl curled up on blood-stained sheets, her small body straining against a pain so intense that even an adult would find it unbearable. The midwives whispered Latin prayers, their solemn faces dancing in the candlelight shadows. Outside, snow fell relentlessly over the Bedfordshire Valley. Yet within these walls, noble lineage was crucified by the suffering of a winter's night. Margaret was far from an ordinary noble maiden. She carried within her veins the royal blood of England. As the granddaughter of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, the fourth son of King Edward III, this lineage rendered her a coveted prize to factions vying for power, yet also a perilous target under constant scrutiny. In the brutal political climate of the 15th century, where the houses of Lancaster and York were on the brink of the Wars of the Roses, those who bore dynastic blood were moved about like pawns upon a chessboard. That night, as Margaret bore each contraction, one realized her life had been shaped by more than physical agony. 13 brief years earlier, she had frolicked among the rose gardens of the castle, crimson petals drifting in the pale dawn. But everything changed, just as she celebrated her first birthday, when her father, John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, fell gravely ill and drew his last breath. The funeral was hurried and ceremonious. Yet human hearts proved even more fragile than a candle flame in the wind. John Beaufort, her powerful father, had led English forces in France during the final years of the 100 Years' War. It was said that those defeats etched a profound despair upon his soul, rendering his eyes hollow, his hands trembling, and his speech growing sparse. Some whispered that he had been poisoned, others attributed his demise to a warrior's wounded pride. Whatever the true cause, his death in May of 1444 thrust young Margaret into a world fraught with power struggles, intrigue, and peril. Margaret's mother, Duchess Margaret de Beaumont, understood that in feudal society, dynastic marriages were the ultimate means of survival. Therefore, as soon as her husband's coffin was sealed, she set about planning her daughter's future. The Duke of Somerset left behind immense estates and a legion of would-be usurpers eager to seize them. As a noble daughter, Margaret was burdened not only with her family's hopes, but with the responsibilities of a kingdom. Born around May of 1443, Margaret grew beneath vaulted chambers of royal court life. Yet her eyes always searched for the absent figure of her father. Each morning, as the pale sun filtered through mullioned windows, she would cross the stone halls. Listening to the echo of her attendants' footsteps, she learned to listen patiently to whispered discussions of political alliances, negotiations that would shape two kingdoms, and the weaponization of marriage. But the winter of 1457 was no season for childhood games. The wind howled through every crack, chilling to the bone, a reminder that medieval life brooked no weakness. As Margaret moaned through each contraction, hot beads of sweat traced her young cheeks. A moment's lapse, and a single snowflake outside could chill her fragile heart. Her pain transcended mere biology. symbolizing the destiny the House of Beaufort had decreed. In that moment, the ragged breaths, whispered prayers, and the crash of wind-driven snow formed a somber symphony. Despite the midwife's efforts, her mother's urgent strategies, and her royal lineage, her small body had to stand firm to deliver a new life. And that life, born in agony, would bear the mission to end the fierce struggle between two great houses and usher in a new dynasty for England. As the candle guttered and the cold pressed in, Margaret felt the echo of the future in her ears. The north wind's moan reminded her that destiny waits for no one, and her noble blood, however exalted, offered no immunity to suffering. On that brutal winter night of 1457, when all seemed poised on the brink of oblivion, it was Margaret, a mere 13-year-old girl, who proved that the human will, however fragile, can kindle a new hope for an entire realm. Just as Margaret had turned 6, her mother, Duchess Margaret de Beaumont, quietly negotiated a strategic marriage with John de la Pole, the son of William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk. This alliance was woven not for childhood games, but from the power calculations of England's two most dominant houses. In the muted glow of golden candles in the great hall, court aides tallied up lands, estates, and troops, exchanging furtive glances behind velvet drapes. Little Margaret, her hair neatly coiled at the nape of her neck, her tiny feet peeking from beneath a sumptuous gown, could not grasp the full meaning of the word alliance. But she felt the solemn, heavy atmosphere settle over the castle like a morning mist. Yet politics does not pause for childhood. In the year 1450, William de la Pole was deposed and put to death while crossing the English Channel. Rumour had it that he had negotiated the cession of Maine and Anjou to France, inciting popular fury and calls for retribution. The sea wind carried these brutal whispers ashore, bringing a storm of outrage to every trading vessel. In an instant, Margaret's betrothal became as worthless as scraps of parchment, scattered by the waves. 12 palaces' worth of titles and wealth vanished like a bridal cap, abandoned on a windswept banquet table. Unwilling to surrender to this setback, her mother's resolute gaze turned to Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, a royal bastard whom Henry V's widow had acknowledged. Secret court channels buzzed with arrangements. Messages were concealed in locked chests, sent to Bletsoe, and at last, in the year 1455, when Margaret was about 12, a grand wedding was held in the very great hall, where she had once played. The floor was strewn with a rich burgundy carpet. The cold stone beneath glinted in torchlight, and a tapestry of 26 intricately embroidered panels depicting Beaufort deeds billowed in the breeze of fanfare. In the adjacent chapel, the tomb of her grandmother stood beneath a carved relief. A solemn reminder of the family's enduring power, feasts were laid out on a long trestle table. Candles flickered upon silks and velvets, and soft music drifted through the air, blending with the song of fair maidens. Yet beneath this aura of splendour lay the tragedy of a stolen childhood. Little Margaret, clad in a gown of costly fabric but with trembling steps, could not comprehend the vows linking two great houses. In that hallowed moment, it was not love or joy being bound. It was ambition and advantage, a political contract rather than a romantic union. It marked the end of her innocence. The wedding night offered no pause for adolescent shyness. Margaret had no time to be startled by the changes to her own body. No sooner had the ceremony concluded than the elders moved to seal the marriage, ushering her into a private chamber as the iron bolt clanged shut behind her. The room fell silent, save for her rapid breath and the distant drift of a flute in the corridor. Her untested body endured its first jolting intimacies. The marks of that night would leave indelible scars. Her young mind reeled with confusion, unable to name the turmoil, but feeling the fierce upheaval in her heart. The physical and psychological trauma of that evening clung to Margaret throughout the years that followed. Sometimes, She would hear the wind rustling along the eaves and imagine it whispering of the sacrifice she'd been forced to make. For the first time, she witnessed power manifest in the form of the man Edmund Tudor, and she realized life contained more than sunshine and roses. From the lingering aches in her bones sprang an unusual resolve. Religion became her sanctuary, the place she turned to heal her wounded spirit. Latin prayers, echoed in the chapel, became the language of her soul, helping her tame anger and fear. Kneeling on a candlelight, her eyes closed tight, she begged for peace and strength. Her wounds were more than flesh. They were memory made vivid, transforming her from a fragile maiden into a woman of steadfast heart. That fierce faith, combined with her growing intellect and survival instincts, forged an inner fortress that would carry Margaret through tumultuous tides of power. After that fateful wedding, she was no longer the carefree child of yesteryear. Each morning, she would stare into the mirror and see a girl who had matured beyond her years, with shadowed circles under her eyes and a crease of worry between her brows. Instead of stifling tears, she learned to offer a discreet smile when political gossip reached her ears, to pore over her marriage contract with her mother, and to remind herself that giving in was not an option. At the age of 12, Margaret Beaufort grasped early that power exacts a toll on both body and soul, and that only an unyielding will could guide her through every trial. And so her story truly began. Behind the hush of Bletsoe Castle's ancient walls, the 12-year-old girl quietly became an unforeseen force, hidden beneath her delicate appearance, but harbouring the ambition and determination of an entire lineage. Every tentative step thereafter was not only for herself, but marked a calculated move, slowly revealing the dormant strength within this young princess. Less than a year after their wedding, Edmund Tudor departed to fight in Wales, leaving Margaret pregnant on the razor's edge between life and death. In the autumn of 1456, dire news arrived in a scene of heartbreak. She was kneeling in Lampy Chapel, whispering prayers for her husband, when the thunder of rain-soaked hooves sounded behind her. The messenger entered, his garments caked with mud and melting snow, his eyes hollow with grief. He barely managed to utter that Edmund had fallen in battle or succumbed to disease in Carmarthen Castle's prison. The 13-year-old girl felt her world contract in that instant, her swollen belly taut with life, cold sweat running down her skin. Jasper Tudor, Edmund's younger brother, assumed the weighty duty of protecting his sister-in-law and the unborn Tudor heir. Without hesitation, he arranged Margaret's journey to Pembroke Castle in Wales, a formidable fortress perched atop jagged cliffs, where Atlantic waves thunder against the stone walls. What should have taken 2 days stretched into 5 arduous ones, as muddy roads, dense mist, and armed bands of uncertain allegiance slowed their progress. Each lurch of the mule-drawn litter sent fresh pangs of agony through Margaret's tender frame, the overlarge child within her, straining against her growing weakness. Her abdomen became as sensitive as a nerve ending, and the bitter sea wind slipping through her cloak made her shiver with each step along the rocky path. The chamber prepared for her at Pembroke felt more like a wind tunnel than a refuge. Thick stone walls, cold as ice, echoed with each gust that hissed through every crack. A single candle flickered upon a rough stone ledge, casting trembling light on an ancient, threadbare carpet. The sparse wooden furnishings offered little barrier against the chill that seeped into her bones. Heavy tapestries hung on the walls to ward off draughts, yet failed to dispel the pervasive, bone-deep cold. Food was scarce, a thin barley porridge and meagre broth seasoned with wilted herbs, scarcely nourishing enough for a girl carrying a child. Each spoonful of lukewarm gruel, Margaret swallowed with closed eyes, steeling herself to retain strength. Every step Margaret took within the castle precincts was a trial. She clung to windowsills or the rough-hewn banister to prevent herself from collapsing onto the flagstone floors. The dim interior, barely lit by a few oil lamps, gave her the sense of wandering through an endless maze. On stormy nights, The crash of waves against the cliffs below reverberated like a drumbeat in her chest, tightening her heart until it felt as though it might burst. Each throb of her pulse reminded her of the dual obligation she bore to bring new life into the world, and to safeguard the Tudor lineage amid the chaos of war. Loneliness enveloped the room. The midwives visited only hourly, checking the child's progress and changing the bandages on her sore heels. Each time one stooped over her, Margaret held her breath at the slightest rustle of fabric, fearing that even a minor disturbance could send her to her knees. Her wide eyes drifted to the heavy drapes shielding the window, hoping for a shaft of dawnlight to bring a message of relief. Yet most hours passed in silence, broken only by her own soft sighs and the mournful whistle of wind outside. During those long, endless days, Margaret's instincts for survival hardened. She recalled her mother's urgent counsel before leaving Bletsoe. "You must be strong, for our future rests upon your small shoulders." Each surge of pain steeled her resolve. She reminded herself that she endured not only for her own sake, but for the fragile life she carried. The thought of that unborn child, so vulnerable, became the sole force driving her through the harshest hours of sacrifice. Time stretched like a dream that would not end. Far-off gulls called out across the sea, a distant echo of life beyond the walls. Margaret would strain to hear, imagining their cry as a whisper of freedom. Though it was but a fleeting illusion, she closed her eyes, drifting into a brief reverie to escape the relentless contractions, only to be jolted awake by the thunder of her own heart, an alarm that reminded her no dream could last forever. Throughout that vigil, she cultivated a sixth sense for danger. She learned to distinguish every footstep in the hallway and the faintest hissing of wind through stone, ever ready for sudden changes. The head midwife murmured to her companions, "This child has a strange, fierce will." Margaret said nothing, pulling her blanket up beneath her chin to conceal her weariness and dread. She understood that in any moment, fate could decide the survival of both mother and child. Then, on another pitch-black night, when her strength threatened to ebb away, Margaret braced herself for each heartbeat as it counted down toward childbirth. In that charged instant, one truth became clear. Though her frame was slight, she was the scion of an ancient heritage. Her will to live fragile as a candle's flame in a wind tunnel had become her guiding light. She knew that even as she fought for her own life and for the future, she would not yield, for carrying the hopes of her lineage meant that surrender would betray all those who had sacrificed before her. And in that haze of anticipation, Margaret Beaufort readied herself for a silent yet indomitable mission. In Pembroke, during the winter of 1456 to 1457, sheets of ice clung to the window panes, and the hearth's embers struggled to dispel the bone-chilling cold. Dr. Lewis Carleton, a veteran accoucheur renowned for delivering queens, stood at the antler-framed window, gazing out at the snow-blanketed landscape before voicing his grave concern. "Margaret's pelvis has not yet fully matured. Yet her child is large, and positioned incorrectly. A natural birth may claim them both." The wind howled through every crack like a warning, and drifts of snow shrouded the horizon as if to smother all hope. Jasper Tudor, not yet 25 years old, faced an agonizing choice: allow Margaret to await nature's course and risk losing mother and child, attempt to turn the baby, risking uterine rupture and fatal bleeding, or proceed with a life-threatening cesarean, which would surely kill the young mother. On that frozen stage, the fate of the Tudor line, political ambition, and personal devotion converged in a single, fateful decision. Throughout the frigid season, Margaret endured not only excruciating physical pain, but also the psychological torment of carrying the weight of a dynasty. Amid that tense weight, Jasper quietly became Margaret's political tutor. He taught her to read the slightest change in a noble's expression, to discern hidden meaning in diplomatic tones, and to identify the factions lurking within court. Margaret, prostrate on her bed, learned to detect the sudden parting of a curtain or the measured step of an unexpected visitor. These covert lessons would become her greatest weapon before her child's birth. Alongside these tutorials in power, Margaret immersed herself in holy texts. She knelt for hours in Pembroke's chapel. A cloth wrapped about her head, her knees grazed, and bleeding on the coarse stone floor. Latin prayers trembled from her lips, as though etching a new faith into her heart, that suffering could be transmuted into strength. Father Meredith of the Castle Church himself, a spiritual guide to many noble women, gently reminded her, "Prayer without action is empty, but deeds rooted in faith can move mountains." That maxim became Margaret's guiding star through the fiercest storms. Those long nights in her chamber became trials of endurance. Margaret not only honed her political instincts, but also fortified an unshakable faith, like a spark rekindled in cold ashes. Each time Jasper visited, he brought not only medical counsel, but tales of alliances behind court doors, of sowing loyalty among the people, and forging influence from the shadows. At last, amid the frozen dark and echoing prayers, Margaret braced for her most pivotal moment. Her child's arrival would not only be a triumph of life, but the clarion call for a political journey spanning decades. With each pang of labour and each echoing prayer throughout Pembroke Castle, Margaret Beaufort came to realise that only unwavering faith and steely resolve could carry her through the storm of birth and beyond. And in the haze of pain, with the blizzard swirling outside her window, she stood ready to welcome the child, destined to herald the Tudor restoration. On the first night of the year, 1457, as the first contraction struck, Margaret collapsed against the cold stone wall, every gust of wind rushing into the birthing chamber as if intent on extinguishing her fragile life. The midwives hurriedly bore her into the delivery room, where coarse cloths had been spread and a table laid out with birthing instruments, herbal poultices, and strings of prayer beads invoking the saints. The first 18 hours passed in agonized screams, blood spattering the stone walls. Dame Gwen Stafford, who had assisted births for more than 30 years, manipulated the baby's position and massaged Margaret with practiced hands, then administered pain-relieving draughts of lavender and rosemary. Yet the crisis showed no sign of abating. When dawn finally broke, Dr. Lewis Carlton and Dame Gwen convened in haste. Their sole recourse was a manual extraction, virtually the only way to save the infant. The sight of a cold blade piercing the body of a 13-year-old girl, sweat, tears, and bright red blood mingling was almost too dreadful to behold. In the hush that followed, a faint ooh, ooh trembled through the room, heralding the survival of Prince Henry Tudor. Margaret, the teenage mother, lay utterly spent, yet resilient, her weak arms unable to reach the newborn. But the air pulsed with boundless hope. The physical aftermath was a harsh sentence: multiple organ tears, severe blood loss, and repeated surgeries to staunch the bleeding. In the days that followed, she endured weeks of intensive care surgeries to control hemorrhage, injections of antiseptic herbal extracts, tonics of fortified wine to restore her strength, and nurses vigilantly monitoring every heartbeat and vital sign. Each morning, Margaret awoke with her body still writhed in pain, her skin hypersensitive as though she had narrowly escaped a brutal battle. Her psyche, too, bore profound wounds. Nightmares haunted her until dawn, leaving her waking in the dark with a strangled cry. She grew to dread even a light touch upon her back or shoulder, fearing any movement might revive that horrific birth. Her bond with her son, Prince Henry Tudor, became forever intertwined with both maternal love and the traumatic memory of that night. Whenever she tentatively touched his back, Margaret trembled, as if dousing a flame that had both lit her life and seared her heart. Standing so close to death, Margaret suddenly revealed extraordinary courage and a keen political mind. Though a teenaged widow, she grasped that her newborn son was not only the heir of the Tudor line, but also the final hope of the Lancastrian cause. In the Wars of the Roses Tro Hong Trung in Vietnamese, a dynastic conflict pitting the House of Lancaster, symbolised by the red rose, against the House of York, symbolised by the white rose for England's throne. Every life was a strategic asset. Henry Tudor's survival carried immense weight. Along Pembroke's icy stone corridors, with snow falling steadily outside the windows, a statesman began to emerge from the frail child who had survived her crucible. Observers saw in her the makings of leadership, steely resolve, a sharp eye for detail, and a burning desire to safeguard her family's power. Her first faltering steps across the rough floor were not simply those of a new mother, but of a strategist plotting her next move. In the weeks following the operation, Margaret spent her hours listening to court emissaries recount the shifting tides of the Wars of the Roses. She memorized the names of each commander, the alliances forged, and the temperaments of rival lords, treating it all as an urgent lesson plan. At the same time, she honed her will through prayer and self-discipline, demonstrating that faith could become a formidable weapon against the immense pressures bearing down upon her. And so, even as the snow continued to blanket the battlements, Margaret Beaufort, the young mother weakened by her ordeal, discovered within herself an astonishing wellspring of inner strength. The image of her, wan and watchful beside her son's cradle, would come to symbolize a new era. It is said that from that pivotal birth or death moment, Margaret was not merely Henry Tudor's mother, but the guiding hand that would steer the Tudor dynasty through the maelstrom of the Wars of the Roses, laying the foundation for her family's and England's future for decades to come. After gradually recovering from her harrowing ordeal of birth, Margaret Beaufort found herself at the eye of a political storm. In the year 1455, the First Battle of St. Albans marked the beginning of the Wars of the Roses, known in Vietnamese as Tro Hong Trung, a dynastic struggle between the House of Lancaster, symbolised by the red rose, and the House of York, symbolised by the white rose. For the English throne, anyone of Lancastrian blood, like Margaret, was automatically deemed an enemy under Yorkist rule. All eyes turned to the newly restored widow, for her newborn son might prove the decisive bargaining chip in the conflict. By the year 1458, Margaret's body had yet to fully heal from her dreadful labour, but her mother, Duchess Margaret de Beaumont, arranged a second marriage for her. This time, her bridegroom was Sir Henry Stafford, the second son of the Duke of Buckingham, a nobleman of considerable influence at the Yorkist court. Their wedding was austere, devoid of the lavish pomp that had marked her union with Edmund Tudor. Candles flickered softly in Bletsoe's chapel. Incense curled through the air, and Margaret advanced in a simple gown, but with firmer steps than before. This marriage was far more pragmatic than romantic. Stafford, although a Yorkist, agreed to wed the Lancastrian widow to secure control over the vast Beaufort estates. The marriage contract guaranteed that Margaret would retain full authority over her property, while Stafford pledged military and political support for their protection. Above all, her son young Henry Tudor, though raised in Wales, under Jasper Tudor's guardianship, remained the linchpin of Lancastrian hopes. Margaret understood that marriage had become a tool of power, transforming her fears of losing her child and her inheritance into a strategy of survival. In the following decade, as King Henry VI was deposed, and then briefly restored in the year 1470, Margaret deftly leveraged her alliance with Stafford, and through him, her ties to the Yorkist court to safeguard herself and her son. Although she and Stafford held opposing political loyalties, they found common cause in preserving the Beaufort legacy and shielding Henry Tudor. Stafford seldom intervened in Margaret's covert networks, yet she mastered the art of planting subtle doubts about Yorkist loyalty in his mind, turning him into a valuable intermediary. Margaret's life after her second marriage remained ceaselessly busy. While Stafford managed military and diplomatic affairs, she immersed herself in the intricate developments of the Wars of the Roses. She memorized the names of each commander, the forged alliances, and the exposed intrigues, treating it all as an urgent curriculum. She meticulously recorded every detail, drafted contingency plans, and prepared for any eventuality that might threaten Henry Tudor. As though tireless, she devoted her evenings to prayer and ascetic disciplines in her private chamber, beneath the dying glow of a single candle. Margaret knelt and whispered Latin verses, clutching her rosary like a lifeline. Friar Meredith had once told her, "Faith without action is empty," and she realized that belief amid chaos was like steel forged in fire. These months of spiritual rigor helped her maintain her composure and expand her covert network of supporters. Meanwhile, Stafford occasionally found himself bemused by rumours of a tenuous betrothal, wondering if he should betray the Yorkists to protect his wife and son. Margaret exploited such hesitations skillfully, sowing small seeds of doubt about Yorkist commitment within his mind, thereby weakening the regime's internal confidence. Each carefully chosen word of hers, though delivered gently, nudged Stafford closer to the Lancastrian cause as the moment grew ripe. And then, amid the shifting tides of Tro Hong Trung, Margaret emerged as a centre of influence. Beneath the calm facade of a young widow, she orchestrated alliances, maintained secret correspondence with Jasper in Wales, and sent coded messages via loyal emissaries. When the Yorkist court showed signs of faltering, Stafford served as her protective shield, and Margaret used her marriage to keep Henry Tudor safe. Even far from the battlefield, in the dim corridors of Pembroke Castle, as snow fell steadily outside the windows, Margaret Beaufort, from the 13-year-old girl who had survived a night of death, had become a formidable woman in her own right. By the faint lamplight, she reminded herself that every step she took was a political maneuver, and that the outcome of the Wars of the Roses would hinge not only on swords and banners, but on the shrewd strategy of hearts steadfast and resolute. Margaret Beaufort understood that she could not weather the political tempest alongside her son. She needed Henry Tudor to come of age in a safe environment. Therefore, she arranged for her young prince to be sent to Wales, a more tranquil realm beyond the direct reach of the Yorkist court. There, the child was placed under the guardianship of Jasper Tudor, Edmund Tudor's brother, a battle-hardened warrior, steadfast in his Lancastrian loyalty. The geographical distance and the age gap meant that Margaret saw her son only a few times each year, and each reunion had to be meticulously coordinated to avoid drawing attention, thus preserving both their safety. The Wars of the Roses, known in Vietnamese as Tro Hong Trung, was the protracted dynastic struggle for England's crown between the House of Lancaster, symbolised by the red rose, and the House of York, symbolised by the white rose. In such a fraught climate, Margaret's link to her son had to remain hidden. To maintain communication, she painstakingly established a secret correspondence network. Letters were penned in invisible ink, encoded with a private cipher, and entrusted to loyal messengers who travelled circuitous routes rather than the main thoroughfares. Each missive conveyed not only strategic instructions and news, but also small tokens, an illustrated psalter, a keepsake chain, or a swatch of crimson rose embroidery to remind Henry of his Lancastrian heritage. At the same time, Margaret leveraged her position beside Sir Henry Stafford to broaden her sphere of influence. She cultivated ties with powerful women from both factions. For example, she corresponded discreetly with Elizabeth Woodville, the Queen of Edward IV, outwardly observing court etiquette while quietly gathering intelligence on Yorkist machinations. Simultaneously, she maintained covert channels with Henry VI's mother and Princess Elizabeth in exile in France, ensuring that Lancastrian allies abroad would be poised to act when needed. These women's networks often proved more reliable than alliances forged by men, as women tended to share information modestly and across ranks. This allowed Margaret to await the right moment to bring Henry Tudor safely home. Any significant political or military developments at the Yorkist court were encoded and relayed to her immediately, enabling rapid response. Her marriage to Stafford, though undeniably pragmatic, also provided her with a robust political shield within Yorkist circles. Stafford, by virtue of his high standing, offered both protection and a buffer against overt attacks. While he entertained royal delegations, Margaret focused on drafting and overseeing their marriage settlement, ensuring her and her son's rights were safeguarded. She kept estate documents under lock and key, engaged legal experts to assess property values, and stood ready to advise Stafford in times of crisis. Moreover, Margaret exploited Stafford's influence to cultivate a clandestine support network. She hosted secret gatherings at Stafford's residence, inviting trusted gentlewomen to exchange news, pass messages, and explore potential political scenarios. In the dimly lit drawing room, Margaret listened intently to stories from widowed noblewomen, discreet nuns with extensive networks, and politically savvy confidantes. She meticulously recorded each detail, weaving them into a comprehensive intelligence tapestry of the surviving Lancastrian cause. To preserve her ambition of restoring Lancaster's power, Margaret devised a dual strategy, raising her son in safe exile and building a web of influential women. Each letter to Wales was not merely a directive, but a reminder of Henry's duty to his lineage. Meanwhile, her female contacts at the Yorkist court and in exile ensured that every move she made was underpinned by loyal allies. To Stafford, she appeared the devoted wife managing household affairs. In truth, she was orchestrating complex political maneuvers. Over the years, as Henry Tudor grew and forged his own acumen, Margaret never ceased yearning for their reunion. She dreamed of the day she would place her son on the throne, ending the Wars of the Roses with a Lancastrian victory. But first, she had to keep Henry safe, protect the Beaufort inheritance, and continue sowing the seeds of her plan so that one day soon, when the moment was ripe, her son could ascend as King Alfred Tudor, a symbol of the dawn of a hopeful new dynasty. Night after night, Margaret murmured to herself, every step, every letter, every hidden liaison is a cornerstone of the future. And as she drifted into a drowsy haze, wrapped in layers of secrecy and heavy expectations, she smiled faintly, certain that with her dual strategy and unwavering resolve, Henry Tudor would one day return to England to script the next chapter for the Lancaster line. The Wars of the Roses, known in Vietnamese as Tro Hong Trung, was the decades-long dynastic struggle for England's throne between the House of Lancaster, symbolised by the red rose, and the House of York, symbolised by the white rose. Every battle was soaked in blood, throwing the kingdom into an unending whirlwind of chaos. That conflict reached its bloody zenith at the Battle of Towton on the 29th of March in the year 1461, when some 50,000 soldiers clashed and nearly half of them perished. In the aftermath, Edward IV ascended the throne, forcing all Lancastrian forces to fall back. Henry VI was deposed and fled into exile. Margaret of Anjou and her youngest son Edward escaped to France, and Margaret Beaufort, together with Sir Henry Stafford, accepted the status of guests under the Yorkist regime in order to preserve their lives and safeguard the vast Beaufort estates. Yet Margaret Beaufort, true Lancastrian by blood, would not submit. She relied on Edward IV's temporary clemency to secure her livelihood. Through her marriage to Stafford, now favoured and ennobled by Edward, she strengthened her husband's role as her Yorkist ally. At the same time, she continued to expand a sophisticated espionage network, bribing merchants who travelled between England and Wales to relay news of Yorkist troop movements, and enlisting local lords and clerics with Yorkist connections to report on internal affairs and military developments in Wales. Where her son was being raised, these clandestine channels enabled Margaret to learn of any Yorkist deployment plans in advance, minimising the danger to Henry Tudor and their wider circle. Whenever unrest stirred at the Yorkist court, she received secret reports immediately, which she used to instruct Stafford and Jasper Tudor on the best courses of action. By the year 1469, when Sir Henry Stafford was wounded at the Battle of Edgecote, sometimes misrecorded as the Battle of Barnet, Margaret found herself with an opportunity to test her soft power. She tended him devotedly for many months, administering fortified tonics and organising devotions on his behalf. Leveraging Stafford's deep gratitude and affection, she deftly planted seeds of doubt about Yorkist loyalties in his mind, reminding him of disloyal courtiers and recounting tales of Lancastrian ancestors who had suffered under Yorkist rule. Without ever openly urging him to rebel, she employed subtle persuasion and the bond of gratitude to gradually shift his support toward her son, preparing the ground for the uprising that would break out 2 years later. Despite the pain of separation from her child, Margaret refused to falter. She resolved to bolster her own knowledge, to face the relentless challenges ahead. To that end, she expanded her personal library from legal codices and theological treatises to works on military strategy and European political history, becoming a self-taught scholar of unparalleled erudition. Whenever news of a Lancastrian defeat reached her, she studied its causes, compared them with historical examples, and recorded how great commanders had turned the tide through diplomacy and intelligence. Margaret pored over Sun Tzu's The Art of War and the Annals of Roman Generals, extracting lessons to apply in defending her son's inheritance. She also immersed herself in the kingdom's statutes, church decrees, and legal covenants to master every loophole she might later exploit on Henry's behalf. Through each setback and triumph, Margaret honed extraordinary resilience. She learned to combine open diplomacy with a hidden web of intelligence. When Stafford met with Yorkist councillors, Margaret drafted anonymous letters to powerful noblewomen, urging them to maintain their allegiance to Lancaster. Even local convents became integral nodes in her information-gathering network. Night after night, by the flicker of candlelight and the soft patter of snow outside her window, Margaret Beaufort quietly rehearsed her dual strategy, raising her son safely in exile, while orchestrating a network of powerful women at court and in exile. She reminded herself that only when Henry Tudor grew wise and garnered sufficient support could he return to England and pen the next chapter in Lancaster's resurgence. And so, as the political storm still raged, and the Wars of the Roses continued to rend the realm, Margaret never ceased dreaming of the day when Henry would stand proudly before the court, affirming the triumph of the Red Rose. But first, she vowed to keep her son's life and honour intact, laying each careful brick in Lancaster's edifice of power, so that, when the hour was right, Henry Tudor might return as a monarch revered by all. In the year 1470, against the backdrop of the Wars of the Roses, a decades-long struggle between the House of Lancaster, whose emblem was the red rose, and the House of York, whose emblem was the white rose, a dramatic reversal took place when Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, nicknamed the Kingmaker, joined forces with Margaret of Anjou to restore King Henry VI to the throne. This brief Lancastrian resurgence opened a fresh opportunity for Margaret Beaufort. She watched each development closely, eagerly weighing the possibility of bringing Prince Henry Tudor back from Wales and positioning him as a rallying point to inflame popular support and launch a major uprising. During the early months of that year, she made discreet contact with the remaining Lancastrian nobles, arranging secret meetings, exchanging ciphered letters, and carefully selecting the moment when Yorkist pressure was most chaotic. Margaret planned with great care, knowing that a single misstep could shatter the entire enterprise. Every dispatch sent to Wales included detailed instructions for Jasper Tudor, directing him to marshal forces, secure internal defences, and gauge public sentiment in and around Pembroke. However, the conspiracy stumbled on betrayal from within the invasion plan. Originating in Brittany was exposed in the month of October, when a courier visiting York Palace overheard crucial details and alerted the court. Margaret was forced to watch as one Lancastrian ally after another was hunted down, some imprisoned, others forced into flight. She herself survived only by Sir Henry Stafford's protection. Her second husband yet was immediately placed under strict house arrest and stripped of her titles. Despite this peril, Margaret refused to remain silent. She continued to send letters, coordinate the surviving loyalists, and carefully maintain her secret communication channels. Under the guise of ordinary domestic affairs, she embedded coded messages in courtly manuscripts and entrusted them to royal ladies travelling in jewellery caskets. Every piece of news about Yorkist movements was intercepted, analysed, and relayed to Jasper in Wales, who then passed the updates to Henry Tudor, urging him to prepare for the moment when the tide would turn again. After nearly 5 years of careful preparation and vigilance, August in the year 1485 brought the moment of reckoning. Henry Tudor, now a mature and resolute leader, departed from his refuge in Brittany with a small force, landing on Welsh shores. From there, they advanced to Pembroke, where Jasper Tudor consolidated local support, then pressed northward to confront King Richard III's army at Bosworth Field on the 22nd of August. Thanks to Margaret's subtle diplomacy and her decades-long cultivation of the Stanley family, Thomas Stanley's troops turned against Richard at the decisive moment. The Yorkist cavalry collapsed. Richard fell in battle, and Henry Tudor was crowned as Henry VII, inaugurating the Tudor dynasty. That restoration, 3 decades in the making, stands as a testament to Margaret's patient strategy and keen political acumen. From the 13-year-old girl who endured such agony in childbirth, she had grown into the kingdom's midwife of change, sowing revolution through marriage alliances, intelligence networks, and sheer personal brilliance. She not only forged the critical alliances that paved the way, but also educated her son to become a masterful strategist, capable of steering England through turbulent times, night after night. By the flicker of candlelight and the whisper of wind against her windows, Margaret Beaufort quietly reflected on her journey, the life and death choices, the clandestine letters, the silent sacrifices. In her dreams, she still smiled with pride at her son and the revived Lancaster line. Henceforth, the red rose would not merely symbolize a family, but herald a new era born of sweat, tears, and the unyielding resolve of an extraordinary mother. After Bosworth, Margaret Beaufort was hailed as the mother of the nation, though she stood among the most powerful figures in the newborn Tudor court. She chose a life of quiet devotion rather than ostentation. In the years that followed her son's triumph, she poured her energy into founding monasteries and chantry chapels, establishing scholarships for deserving youths, and supporting orphanages for children of Lancastrian families left destitute by decades of war. She walked the cloistered aisles of new convents in humble robes, tending to the needs of novice nuns and overseeing alms distribution to the poor. Her charity extended to caring personally for orphaned boys and girls, teaching them prayers and letters in equal measure, so that no child born under the scarlet banners of Lancaster would grow up without hope. Yet behind this aura of sanctity lay a heart still burdened by sorrow. Margaret witnessed her son, King Henry VII, encourage peace between York and Lancaster by marrying Elizabeth of York, uniting the white rose with the red. She saw the cheers that welcomed her son's entry into London, the pageantry that marked the end of civil strife. But in those gilded halls, she never found the simple motherly closeness she had once yearned for. Henry, now king, moved among his courtiers with solemn duty, while Margaret's memories of her own youthful suffering in childbirth and the constant fear for her child's survival cast a quiet shadow over their relationship. Their greetings were cordial, their conversations formal. The warmth of a mother's embrace remained just beyond her reach. Margaret lived on into the early months of 1509, surviving long enough to see her son firmly crowned and his peace settled. Yet, she did not linger to witness the full flourishing of the Tudor age. Just days after her son's coronation, she passed away peacefully in her own bed. Her final breath, a soft exhalation of relief and lingering purpose. Her body was borne in solemn procession to Westminster Abbey, where she was laid to rest in a chantry chapel of dark marble. Upon her tombstone was carved a brief Latin encomium, its few words distilled from a life of sacrifice. Mater patriae et quidquid, faciam non recuso, mother of the nation. And whatever I have done, I cannot regret. Her journey from those anguished screams echoing in a Welsh fortress to the thunderous applause greeting a victorious king encapsulates the extraordinary power of her will, intellect, and steadfast devotion. In the silent nights after her death, courtiers would pause by her tomb to offer a prayer for her soul, struck by how one woman's quiet labours, far from battlefields or thrones, could reshape the fate of an entire realm. Her legacy endured not only in the peace she helped build, but in the lives she touched, the scholars granted learning, the nuns sheltered in new convents, and the orphans who found homes under her gentle care. Margaret Beaufort remains, to history, far more than the king's mother. She stands as a testament to what perseverance, strategic mind, and courageous compassion can achieve even in an age that underestimated women's capacities for power. Through years of turmoil, she moved discreetly, yet decisively, marrying for alliance, assembling intelligence networks, and marshalling resources to protect her son and her house. In her final act, she laid down not weapons, but legacies, foundations of learning, sanctuaries of mercy, and institutions of faith that would guide the Tudor dynasty toward a new dawn. Night after night, as candlelight flickered in the abbey's shadowed chapels, Margaret's spirit seemed to whisper on the cold marble, "Build wisely, love deeply, and let no suffering be in vain." And so her story endures etched in stone, woven into courtly lore, and carried forward on the wings of history, an enduring reminder that the greatest revolutions often begin with a mother's steadfast heart. After the death of Sir Henry Stafford in 1471, Margaret Beaufort found herself nearly 30 and twice widowed, facing a pivotal decision for her own future and that of her son. Rather than retreat into obscurity with an unremarkable nobleman, she chose to form an alliance with Thomas Stanley, Earl of Derby, widely regarded as one of the savviest players at the English court. Stanley's reputation for siding with the victor at the last possible moment made him an indispensable partner in the turbulent politics of the day. Their marriage was anything but understated. For 3 days, Bletsoe Castle was transformed into the stage for a grand spectacle, a solemn religious ceremony in the ancient chapel, followed by a series of jousts in the courtyard. Each knighted contest, a showcase of martial prowess. At night, sumptuous banquets echoed with minstrels' songs and laughter beneath richly embroidered tapestries. Even King Edward IV, once a sworn enemy of the Lancastrian cause, graced the final feast with his presence, a clear signal that Stanley and Margaret had secured a formidable place in the realm's power structure. No longer could Margaret be dismissed as a vulnerable widow. She had become a figure whose alliances commanded respect and caution. The marriage contract itself was crafted with painstaking precision to safeguard Beaufort interests. Margaret retained exclusive control over all Beaufort estates and revenues, prescribing exactly which lands and revenues would descend to her son, Prince Henry Tudor. In return, Stanley pledged the full might of his military retinues in northwest England, border lords, seasoned men-at-arms, and trusted retainers to defend Margaret and her young heir. This union of Stanley's martial strength with Margaret's diplomatic acuity forged a two-pronged alliance capable of guiding the Tudor claim forward when the moment was right. Immediately upon securing this new partnership, Margaret dove deeper into the Yorkist court's inner workings. She attended formal receptions by Stanley's side, all the while reading the subtle cues and whispers among courtiers. Stanley's own position, formerly loyal to York, was now bolstered by his marriage into the Lancastrian line, making him a bridge between opposing factions. Through him, Margaret gained entree to networks of influence that would have remained closed to a mere Lancastrian widow. In quiet corners of the palace, she gathered intelligence on Yorkist deployments, gleaned tidbits of court intrigue, and identified nobles whose loyalties might yet shift. Meanwhile, Stanley capitalized on his wife's connections to strengthen his own foothold in the northwest. Hostile barons, once wary of his Yorkist ties, now recognized that his marriage to Margaret Beaufort offered them a stake in the Tudor cause. It proved a mutually reinforcing arrangement. He provided military cover for her, and she offered him an expanded network of Lancastrian allies. Together, they balanced on the cusp of both dynastic factions, a living testament to the possibility of reconciliation, even in divided times. Margaret's third marriage thus became more than a personal consolation. It was a masterstroke of diplomacy. She converted her personal tragedies, widowed twice, and raising a future king in exile, into a potent tool for political survival. Her new status shielded her from outright persecution, while granting her unprecedented leverage. No longer was she merely a bereft mother awaiting her son's return. She was a central architect in the strategy that would eventually enthrone Henry Tudor. This strategic positioning laid the groundwork for the final, decisive reversal of fortunes. With Stanley's forces ready at hand, and Margaret's espionage network humming with information, for the long campaign to reclaim the throne could move forward when the opportune moment arrived. Their combined resources, military, financial, and informational, became the pillars supporting the ultimate challenge to King Richard III. In forging this third alliance, Margaret Beaufort transcended the traditional role of a noble widow. She transitioned from a figure of sympathy into a linchpin of Tudor ascendancy. Every clause of her marriage contract, every reception she hosted, and every whisper she exchanged in shadowed galleries contributed to a web of influence that would carry her son to power. In this way, Margaret's personal resilience and diplomatic ingenuity transformed private grief into public triumph. Through her third marriage, Margaret Beaufort seized control of her own destiny and, by extension, that of the Tudor lineage, no longer defined by loss. She became the strategic heart of a campaign that would end centuries of dynastic bloodshed. It was this alliance, born from personal loss and political necessity, that ultimately enabled Margaret's vision to culminate in Henry Tudor's victory and the birth of the Tudor dynasty. Leveraging her status as the Countess's wife of Derby, Margaret Beaufort and Thomas Stanley wove an intricate web of intelligence gathering across England and Wales. Margaret quietly recruited merchants, plying trade routes between the two realms, enlisting them to observe troop movements and overhear court gossip. She also tapped local clergy abbots, priors, even humble parish priests, tasked with noting the shifting loyalties of their lay patrons. On occasion, she bribed mid-level Crown officials to slip her whispered updates on Yorkist deliberations in Westminster. Each fragment of information made its way to Margaret through covert correspondence dispatches written in invisible ink, annotated with private cipher symbols, sometimes concealed within what appeared to be routine commercial invoices or family invitations. Meanwhile, across the Channel in Brittany, her son Henry Tudor continued to grow under Jasper Tudor's guardianship. Though separated by rugged terrain, Margaret maintained a constant flow of care packages, priced brocade fabrics, fine primers for reading, and devotional volumes sent through veiled channels. Every gift carried a coded note inquiries into his health, subtle encouragements to maintain discipline, and veiled reports of political wins back home. By these means, she sought to ensure that Henry remained well informed, psychologically fortified, and prepared for the day he would return. In the autumn of the year 1471, young Henry Tudor slipped away from Wales under cover of darkness, embarking on a clandestine voyage to Brittany. The network Margaret had established sprang into action. Local fishermen ferried messages across the Channel, and Breton port officials discreetly compensated, allowed couriers safe passage. Through this operation, Margaret received regular bulletins on her son's progress, his physical vigor, his private studies, his dreams for someday reclaiming his birthright. Their letters, like pieces of a grand strategic puzzle, formed an ongoing intelligence campaign that enabled her to continue directing events from afar. An opportune moment finally presented itself in April of 1483. News arrived that King Edward IV had died suddenly, leaving his 12-year-old son, Edward V, as nominal monarch. Power quickly became contested between the boy's protectors and the ambitious Duke of Gloucester Richard, who would soon claim the crown himself. Yorkist authority teetered under rumours that the young princes in the Tower had been silently removed. Sensing that public faith in York was fracturing, Margaret intensified her outreach to disaffected nobles and foreign backers of Lancaster. Through clandestine emissaries, she offered hope of renewal under her son's banner, quietly marshalling support for an uprising that could unseat Richard. As Yorkist control weakened, Margaret's role shifted from distant mother to essential coordinator. She arranged secret powwows at secluded manors, small gatherings of Lancastrian sympathisers, continental mercenary agents, and influential exiles from France. In these shadowed rooms, she laid out plans for coordinated rebellions in Wales, the Midlands, and the North. Meanwhile, her husband Stanley maintained a facade of obedient service at court, ensuring that whispers of Henry's promise reached attentive ears without betraying his wife's true designs. Through these efforts, Margaret transformed her genteel identity into that of a power broker, the sanctified widow who, behind a mask of piety, quietly determined the fate of armies. She used her network of merchant spies to track troop dispositions, her religious contacts to stir morale, and her formal marriage ties to Stanley as a shield against suspicion. From her unassuming lodgings, she orchestrated alliances with foreign princes, offering small contingents of troops, all slated to converge when the signal was given. In the months that followed, messages sped between Brittany and the British Isles, each missive carrying the weight of an impending revolt. Margaret monitored responses with the keen attention of a general inspecting his lines. When the moment came for her son to cross back into Wales and rally his adherents, every element of her covert machinery stood ready to respond. Lances raised at Pembroke, banners unfurled in Shrewsbury, and the whisper network in London poised to spread word of his renewed claim. By the time Henry Tudor moved on to Bosworth Field in August of 1485, Margaret's blueprint for rebellion was fully realised. The decisive shift of the Stanley forces at the last hour, an act long in the making, shaped by her persistent diplomacy, turned the tide. Richard III's army collapsed, and Henry Tudor emerged as the new sovereign. Yet the victory owed as much to Margaret's sleepless vigilance and the intelligence empire she had so carefully constructed as to any battlefield valour. In this way, Margaret Beaufort recast herself from a twice-widowed noblewoman into the indispensable architect of her son's triumph. Her mastery of espionage, her strategic alliances with merchants and clergy, and her ability to exploit court politics all stemmed from a single conviction that the future of Lancaster depended on her unrelenting resolve. And when Henry VII ascended the throne, he did so not merely as a warrior king, but as the culmination of a mother's decades-long campaign waged in silence, encoded in letters, and led from the shadows of history. In October of 1483, Margaret Beaufort's hopes for her son's invasion from Brittany were dashed by betrayal from within her own ranks. A trusted courier had leaked the rendezvous plans, and Yorkist spies intercepted the sealed letters meant for her allies. Word spread quickly that Lancastrian forces were preparing to land in Wales, and within days, a wave of arrests and executions swept through those nobles suspected of complicity. Many of Margaret's closest confidants, lords, knights, and even a few Yorkshire gentry were dragged before tribunals and condemned as traitors. The crisis was profound. Richard III, proclaiming himself guardian of the realm, doubled down on security measures, seizing estates and titles from anyone with known Lancaster sympathies. Though she had orchestrated the conspiracy, Margaret was spared the scaffold only by the protective shadow of her husband, Thomas Stanley. Instead of a traitor's death, she found herself stripped of her titles, and confined to her northern manor under strict house arrest. Guards patrolled every corridor, and her household staff was reduced to a handful of the most loyal servants. Yet even in this iron grip, Margaret refused to surrender her agency. By the flicker of candlelight each night, she penned clandestine instructions on fragile sheets of parchment, scrawling in invisible ink and sealing her missives with obscure cipher marks. A few nights each week, a discreet page would slip these notes out beneath the castle gate, delivering her words to a covert courier network that risked everything to keep her strategy alive. Under Yorkist surveillance, Margaret maintained her links to Wales with remarkable ingenuity. She exploited her remaining freedom of movement, limited though it was to dispatch messages concealed in mundane correspondence. A letter of condolence to a noble widow here, an invitation to a harvest festival there. In each envelope, she tucked tiny strips of paper bearing updates for Jasper Tudor, and a handful of steadfast barons assembled around Pembroke. Those in Wales, in turn, sent her their own encrypted replies, reports on troop dispositions, murmurs of unrest in local manors, and assessments of peasant sentiment under York's heavy levies. Housebound and dispossessed, Margaret turned these months of sequestration into a period of strategic reflection. She reviewed every channel she had established: the merchants who ferried news between Cheshire and Cardigan, the parish priests who heard whispers in dimly lit confessionals, the Breton fishermen who smuggled letters through dawn mists. She pruned weaker branches, rewarded loyal operatives with tokens of her favour, and reconfigured routes to evade New Yorkist patrols. By doing so, she kept her web of influence taut, ready to spring when a fresh opportunity arose. Despite the loss of her estates and the near-constant presence of Yorkist sentinels, Margaret's resolve only hardened. Each day under house arrest, she observed the rhythms of courtly life from behind. Barred windows, the comings and goings of ambassadors, the lavish banquets thrown to celebrate Yorkist victories, and the nervous glances exchanged among courtiers uncertain of their own fates. She took meticulous mental notes: the infighting among York's ministers, the groans of the commons under heavy taxation, the grooms' hushed talk of a possible Lancastrian resurgence. All of it fed back into her growing dossier of intelligence, sharpening her sense of when the world might tilt once again. Rather than appearing as a broken widow bereft of power, Margaret now embodied the steely will of a seasoned strategist. She accepted the deprivation of personal liberty as a necessary sacrifice, a small price to pay for the grand design of placing Henry Tudor on the throne. When word came in early 1885 of Edward V's disappearance and Richard III's coronation became more openly disputed, Margaret quietly dispatched her most trusted letters, the ones Jasper Tudor had termed the rallying call. These letters went out under cover of official dispatches, instructing her network to ready arms in Wales, to secure secret muster points in the marches, and to prepare for her son's return with the speed and stealth of a tide rolling in under moonlight. Thus, in the years following Richard's seizure of power, Margaret Beaufort's house arrest became less a prison and more a command post. Every whispered message that passed her threshold, every coded reply she sent back, fanned the embers of Lancaster's cause. She turned her northern confinement into a crucible for planning, forging her schemes in the hush between Yorkist patrols. Step by patient step, she prepared the stage for that final, decisive moment when Henry Tudor's exile would end, and the red rose would bloom anew upon the English throne. By the time those covert orders reached Wales, the machinery of revolt was already in motion. Fields once quiet under Yorkist banners stirred with armed men gathering in secret musters, and villages that had known only spiked pottage and heavy taxation now whispered of a coming dawn. And all the while, Margaret Beaufort, twice widowed, her lands confiscated, her titles revoked, remained the unseen architect of it all. Her mind, the vault in which the future of Lancaster slowly took shape. In the still hours before dawn, as Yorkist torches flickered in the courtyard, she would close her eyes and murmur a single prayer that this final campaign, born of her unyielding spirit, would at last restore her son to the throne and bring an end to the Wars of the Roses. After nearly 2 years spent in careful preparation under the protective umbrella of Thomas Stanley and the vast clandestine alliance Margaret Beaufort had constructed, Henry Tudor at last set foot on English soil at Milford Haven in August of 1485. With only a modest force at his back, he moved swiftly along the rugged southwestern coast, seizing control of key ports and coastal settlements that remained sympathetic to Lancaster. Word of his landing spread quickly through the small market towns of Cornwall and Devon, stirring the local gentry and commoners alike to rally beneath the red rose banner. From these footholds, Henry pressed onward, riding hard toward the rolling hills and pastoral villages of the Welsh marches, each mile bringing him closer to the heart of the realm. Behind him, the hidden network Margaret had nurtured supplied him with fresh recruits, provisions, and intelligence on the dispositions of Yorkist garrisons. Merchants carried secret missives, tucked between bolts of cloth, and sympathetic clergy slipped psalters containing ciphered updates into the hands of loyal retainers. By the time Henry's small but determined column reached the edge of the Midlands, the word of his approach had already sown mistrust among Richard III's regional commanders. The seeds of dissent Margaret had planted through years of discreet persuasion began to bear fruit. All of these threads of planning, espionage, and alliance wove themselves into a single, fateful tapestry on the muddy fields near Market Bosworth on the 22nd of August 1485. The day broke under low, sullen skies, and Henry's men, battle-hardened exiles and fresh recruits alike, stood face to face with the king's army. Arrayed in gleaming plate and bristling spears, Richard III arrived with his flagship knights, his banner flying amid cries of God and St. George. But as the two forces clashed amid the quaggy ground, it was Thomas Stanley's move that would tip the scales at the height of battle. Stanley's cavalry, having spent the morning watching both sides, wheeled away from Richard's flank and charged instead against the king's rear. It was a moment of calculated treachery 2 decades in the making, one that echoed Margaret's earliest diplomatic overtures to the Stanley household. As Richard's men faltered under the shock of betrayal, Henry Tudor seized the moment, rallying his own troops with a cry of "For Lancaster!" in the swirl of steel and mud. The Yorkist king found himself isolated. When he charged forward to confront his usurper in single combat, he was met not by loyal guards, but by Henry's steady sword arm. Richard III fell amid the mire, and with him fell the Yorkist claim that had torn the kingdom apart for so many years. In the stunned aftermath, Henry's troops raised him aloft as saviour and sovereign. Within days, he made his way to London, where the city cried out, "Long live King Henry!" The young Duke was crowned Henry VII in Westminster Abbey. And with that act, the Wars of the Roses, known in Margaret's native tongue as Tro Hong Trung, came finally to a close. Decades of bloodshed, betrayal, and shifting alliances were at an end, replaced by the promise of union under a single crown. For Margaret Beaufort, the scene of her son's triumph must have felt surreal. The very child born under such circumstances of pain and secrecy in the winter gloom of Pembroke was now England's first Tudor king. She had never stood on the battlefield nor led a charge. Her victories were waged in drawing rooms, convents, and along concealed trails, through 3 marriages, an intricate web of merchants and monks, and the enduring loyalty of women in every rank of society. She had built the foundation upon which Henry's crown now rested, and so it was that Margaret Beaufort emerged as the war's silent architect. Its unseen general, her marriage alliances provided safe havens and political shields. Her intelligence network kept Henry informed and unbowed. Her cultivation of female sympathizers ensured that no whisper of rebellion went unheard. In orchestrating this quiet revolution, she spared her country yet another season of carnage. She placed her son upon the throne not through the shedding of vast armies' blood, but through the patient art of diplomacy, surveillance, and unwavering resolve. As Henry VII's procession wound its way beneath banners of the united red and white rose, it was Margaret who watched from the sidelines, twice a widow, nearly 4 decades into a life marked by hardship and strategy. Knowing that the Tudor era had begun, her earliest tears in that Pembroke chamber had long since dried, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of a plan fulfilled. And though her hand had remained hidden in the final deed, it had guided the fate of England to a new chapter of peace and prosperity. Thus, from the bogs of Bosworth to the vaulted nave of Westminster, the story of Margaret Beaufort came full circle, a child born amidst agony, a widow forged in political strife, and a mother whose steady hand shaped the destiny of an entire realm. In the hush of candle-lit corridors and the hush of post-battle calm, her legacy endured proof that sometimes the greatest power lies not in sword or spear, but in the mind and heart of one indomitable woman. After the mud and blood of Bosworth Field had settled, Margaret Beaufort assumed the revered title of Mother of the Nation and, in the new Tudor court, was honoured as Queen Mother, yet she declined to use her exalted rank for ostentation or personal gain. Instead, she turned her energies to works of mercy and social reform that echoed her lifelong commitment to Lancaster's displaced families. Across England, she founded numerous charitable institutions, orphanages that sheltered the children of fallen Lancastrian knights, infirmaries where the poor and the injured received care, and almshouses, offering refuge to the elderly left destitute by war. She endowed scholarships for the sons and daughters of dispossessed noble houses, ensuring that even in defeat, Lancastrian blood might find education and opportunity. Her hand can be traced in the soaring spires of chapels she commissioned, in the cloisters of convents she rebuilt, and in the humble cottages where a widow or a war orphan found a hearth and a measure of hope. Margaret's compassion was matched by a vision for the intellectual renewal of her kingdom. In her private study, she continued to expand a magnificent library. Volumes in Latin, French, and English lined the shelves. From Augustine's Confessions to Peter Lombard's Sentences, from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales to the newly printed classics of the Renaissance, she sponsored translation projects, dispatching scribes to render theological treatises into the vernacular so that laypeople might read of divine mercy in their own tongue. Scholars from Oxford and Cambridge journeyed to her residences, seeking her patronage and guidance. Many later acknowledged her as one of the great benefactors of English learning. Under her watchful eye, the quiet hum of copying manuscripts and the whispered debates over philosophy became yet another front in her lifelong struggle to shape the fate of her nation. On the 29th of June in the year 1509, just days after her son, Henry VII, had been crowned in the pageantry of Westminster, Margaret Beaufort passed away. She died peacefully in her bed, surrounded by the simple comforts she herself had provided for others, a quilt stitched by orphaned hands, a taper glowing in the dusk. Her body was borne in solemn procession through the abbey's nave, accompanied by chanting monks and the silent sorrow of courtiers who had come to revere her quiet strength. In the Lady Chapel of Westminster Abbey, she was laid to rest beside kings and queens, her black marble tomb engraved with a brief Latin epitaph, Mater Gentis Tudororum, Perpetuum Pecem Struxit, Mother of the Tudor line, who built peace through suffering. Even as the years pass, the echo of that first agonized scream which heralded the birth of Margaret Beaufort continues to resonate in English memory. From the blood-soaked birthing chamber at Pembroke to the tumultuous cheers that greeted her son's victory at Bosworth, her life stands as proof that the power of unwavering will, courageous spirit, and profound learning can reshape the destiny of a kingdom. Her legacy endures not only in the peace and stability of the Tudor age, but in the institutions she founded: hospitals, schools, and charities that outlasted her, long shelters for those in need. Margaret's example inspired generations that came after her. In times of hardship, her story was told to young noblewomen, illustrating how a single woman's resolve could bend the arc of history. University tutors cited her support in lectures on patronage and politics. Parish priests invoked her memory when preaching on charity and duty. Even in the dusty archives of country families, letters embroidered with her cipher and accounts of her philanthropic disbursements remained. Treasured relics of an age when faith, sacrifice, and intellect combined to forge a new era. And so, in the hush of candlelit chapels and the quiet corridors of Oxford libraries, the name Margaret Beaufort lives on. She who began life in agony and ended it in the majesty of peace reminds us that sometimes the greatest victories are won not by swords or siege engines, but by the patient art of compassion, education, and strategic foresight. In the soft murmur of scholars translating her treasured tomes, in the laughter of children reading by lantern light in schools she endowed, and in the very fabric of English charity, her spirit endures night after night. As Westminster's high windows catch the moonlight, one can still imagine Margaret's gentle voice urging the next generation, serve well, learn deeply, and love generously. Her life remains a quiet testament proof that a mother's resolve, guided by faith and wisdom, can indeed change the course of a nation. In the story of Tudor England, hers is the first act, the painful cry, the hidden counsel, the selfless devotion, and finally the promise of a peaceful dawn. Margaret Beaufort's journey was not merely a chronicle of bloodshed and political manoeuvring, but also a wellspring of profound lessons on willpower, perseverance, and the transformative power of knowledge. This video makes it clear that true authority does not solely arise from the sword or the throne, but from quiet, patient acts of compassion and resilience. Margaret began her life with the agonized scream of a 13-year-old. Yet she went on to ignite a flame of hope for an entire lineage, guiding her son through peril, ending a bloody civil war, and ushering in a new era of peace. Perhaps the greatest takeaway is this: great change is often built upon humble, steadfast actions. We learn to turn personal tragedy into the catalyst for positive influence, understanding that courage is not only enduring hardship but nurturing others, applying knowledge, and channeling emotion into the creation of a better future. Margaret never set foot on a battlefield, yet she won by weaving alliances, protecting her son, fostering learning for generations to come, and comforting those in need. Through this video, viewers realize that anyone, woman or man, young or old, can contribute to grand transformations by nurturing ambition, continuing to learn, and never abandoning faith in tomorrow. It is not where we start, but the journey we undertake and the heart we carry along the way that truly matter. Remember, every hardship can become a stepping stone, and with a single resolute heart, we can pen new chapters not only for ourselves, but for our communities and for history itself.